Chapter 1: A Nation Unprepared. Before the first American soldier set foot on a battlefield, before the first tank rolled off an assembly line, the United States faced another question entirely. Was the nation even ready for war? In 1939, the answer was simple. No. The Great Depression had left deep scars on the economy. Factories that once thrived during the industrial boom stood silent. Assembly lines were idle. Companies were cautious and underfunded. Millions of Americans struggled to rebuild their lives. The U.S. Army, in manpower and equipment, ranked 17th in the world, behind countries like Romania and Portugal. Its tanks were outdated, its aircraft obsolete, its navy powerful, but nowhere near ready for a two-ocean war. And yet, the threat growing overseas would require something unprecedented, a military and industrial transformation on a scale the world had never seen. But transforming a nation is not merely a matter of willpower, it is a matter of money. War is expensive, not only in lives, but in dollars, vast, unimaginable amounts of dollars. Money for weapons, money for factories, money for materials, wages, fuel, logistics, and global supply chains stretching from Detroit to the Pacific. And in 1939, the United States government simply did not have the financial capability to sustain a global conflict. Tax revenues were low, budgets were tight. The memory of the Depression haunted every fiscal decision. Political resistance to large deficits remained high. So where would the money come from? From Wall Street? Too small. From higher taxes? Too slow. From selling bonds? Not enough. Not yet. There was only one institution capable of unlocking the financial engine the war required. One institution with the power to expand the money supply, stabilize markets, and enable the government to borrow on a scale never seen before. The Federal Reserve. In 1939, the Fed was far from the global powerhouse we know today. Its balance sheet was small, its influence was limited, its authority constantly debated. But what it had, what no other institution possessed, was the ability to reshape America's financial architecture from the inside. The Federal Reserve would become the quiet force behind the greatest wartime mobilization in human history. It would uncap credit, freeze interest rates, eliminate financial bottlenecks, and convert a struggling post-Depression economy into a war machine capable of producing 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, 2.4 million military trucks, thousands of ships, and billions of rounds of ammunition. But all of that would come later. In 1939, the United States stood at a crossroads, uncertain, unprepared, and financially constrained. The world was about to discover that modern war is not won on the battlefield first. It is won in the ledgers of central banks, and the first battle the United States had to fight was financial. Chapter 2: The Rate Freeze That Changed Everything. Financing a global war requires more than willpower. It requires control. Control over money, over debt, over the cost of borrowing itself. And in 1942, the U.S. government faced a terrifying reality. It needed to borrow more money than any nation in history. But there was a problem. Under normal market conditions, when a government borrows too much, interest rates go up. Higher rates mean higher costs, and higher costs make war financing unsustainable. The market was about to push borrowing costs sky high. So the Federal Reserve did something radical, something no central bank had ever done on this scale. It froze interest rates permanently across the entire bond market. This was not persuasion, it was intervention on a historic scale. Short-term treasury bills, locked at 0.375%. Long-term government bonds, capped at 2.5%. No matter what happened in the market, no matter how much the government borrowed, no matter how many billions were needed, rates would not move. This single decision changed the entire financial landscape of World War II. For the US Treasury, it was a dream. It meant unlimited borrowing at predictable costs, a blank check for the war effort. For banks, it meant certainty. They could buy government bonds without fear of fluctuating prices. For the public, it made war bonds appear safe, stable, and patriotic. And for the Federal Reserve, it meant assuming the role of wartime stabilizer, guaranteeing an entire financial market with its own balance sheet. The Fed committed itself to maintaining these artificial rates by any means necessary. If bond prices fell, it would buy. If liquidity dried up, it would print money. If panic emerged, it would intervene instantly. And intervene it did. Between 1942 and 1945, the Federal Reserve purchased billions of dollars worth of Treasury securities, expanding its balance sheet at a pace no one had imagined possible just a decade earlier. This was financial engineering. Not for profit, not for investors, but for survival. The consequences were enormous. The Treasury could fund the construction of tens of thousands of aircraft. Shipyards could expand overnight. Factories could hire millions of workers. Suppliers could borrow cheaply to convert civilian production into military output. In effect, the Fed transformed every government bond into a tool of war, every interest rate into a weapon, every dollar of liquidity into fuel for the military machine. But beyond the economics, something deeper happened. The rate freeze changed the relationship between the Federal Reserve and the US government forever. Until then, the Fed had maintained a cautious independence. But during the war, it became an extension of national policy, a financial command center working in perfect synchrony with the Treasury. This cooperation would help win the war, but also create tensions that would last long after the last shot was fired. For now, though, the mission was simple. Keep borrowing cheap, keep production flowing, keep the war funded. The rate freeze, quiet, technical, invisible to the public, became the foundation for one of the greatest military expansions ever undertaken. And it marked the moment when the Federal Reserve stopped merely managing the economy and began mobilizing it. Chapter 3. War Bonds, the greatest marketing campaign in history. Even with interest rates frozen, the United States still faced a massive challenge. The government needed money, far more than taxes could provide, and far more than banks alone could supply. So the Roosevelt administration launched one of the most ambitious financial projects in history: war bonds. War bonds were not just investments. They were a national movement, a campaign that blended patriotism, psychology, marketing, and finance into a single unstoppable force. The idea was simple. Every American, rich or poor, should help fund the war. But the execution, that was revolutionary. Hollywood stars promoted them on stage and radio. Frank Sinatra, Judy Garland, and Bing Crosby sang for bond drives. Baseball games paused mid-inning so stadium announcers could urge fans to buy bonds. Children brought coins to school to fill victory stamp books. Barbershops, grocery stores, and neighborhood clubs competed to see who could raise the most. And behind all this enthusiasm was the Federal Reserve, ensuring that war bonds were stable, safe, and appealing. The Fed guaranteed bond prices by using its rate freeze policy. It stood ready to intervene if markets shifted. It coordinated with thousands of banks across the country to sell bonds efficiently and securely. But the genius of the program wasn't financial. It was emotional. War bonds turned the war effort into something personal. When a mother bought a bond, she felt she was protecting her son overseas. When a factory worker saved $1 a week, he felt he was fueling a tank on the front lines. When children bought stamps, they believed, correctly, that they were helping build airplanes. The US government didn't just ask for money, it asked for belief, and Americans responded. By the end of the war, over 85 million Americans, more than half the population, had purchased war bonds. The total raised more than $185 billion, worth trillions today. Never before in history had a government mobilized the savings of an entire population on this scale. But there was another, deeper purpose to war bonds. One the public rarely thought about. War bonds removed money from circulation. This helped fight inflation. Every dollar spent on a bond was a dollar not spent on consumer goods, which were already scarce due to rationing. Saving became patriotic. Spending became discouraged. In effect, war bonds allowed the government to redirect the nation's entire economic behavior. People worked more, spent less, saved more, and all of it contributed to the war machine. Hollywood made films about war bonds. Radio hosts read dramatic scripts. Newspapers ran cartoons, charts, slogans, and emotional appeals. One poster read, "If you can't go to war, you can at least support the boy who does." Another, "Buy bonds to finish the job." It was the greatest marketing campaign ever launched, combining patriotism with financial necessity. And beneath all the posters, speeches, and concerts was the Federal Reserve, ensuring that the entire system worked smoothly, quietly stabilizing the bond market behind the scenes. War bonds were the financial bloodstream of the war. Without them, the United States could not have built the war machine that defeated the Axis powers. The next chapter of the financial war would be much harder. Chapter 4: The Fed's Battle Against Inflation. By 1942, the US war machine was accelerating at full speed. Factories were reopening. Millions were finding jobs. Production soared beyond anything the world had seen. But with this transformation came a new danger, one that could cripple the war effort without firing a single shot: inflation. When millions of workers suddenly have wages, when factories are running day and night, when raw materials become scarce, prices begin to rise. And if prices rise too fast, the war effort collapses. Workers demand higher wages. Factories become unstable. Savings lose value. War bonds become unattractive. And financial chaos spreads. The United States government could not fight a global war while losing control of its own economy at home. So the Federal Reserve was given a new mission: prevent inflation at all costs. But the challenge was enormous. The government was injecting unprecedented amounts of money into the economy. War contracts, military manufacturing, transport systems, supply chains, new bases, new factories, new weapons. This money had to go somewhere, and if Americans spent it freely, prices would skyrocket. So the Fed, working with the Office of Price Administration, implemented one of the most aggressive economic stabilization programs in American history. It began with price controls. Essential goods, meat, sugar, gasoline, clothing, were given fixed maximum prices. Store owners could not charge more, even if supplies were limited. Then came wage controls. Factories were forbidden from raising wages above certain limits, preventing a bidding war for workers that would drive up labor costs and ultimately, inflation. Next came consumer credit restrictions. Buying cars on installment, prohibited. New household appliances, delayed. Luxury goods, almost non-existent. The Federal Reserve limited bank lending for non-essential purposes. Loans became harder to obtain, not because banks lacked money, but because the Fed intentionally tightened consumer credit. But perhaps the most dramatic wartime measure was rationing. Every American received ration books with small removable stamps. You could not buy gasoline without a coupon. You could not buy sugar, coffee, shoes, or tires without authorization. This wasn't just policy. This was social engineering. The government needed every possible resource, rubber, fuel, metal, cloth, food, directed away from civilian use and into the war machine. Inflation control was not about punishing citizens. It was about ensuring the Allied armies had what they needed to survive. But the Federal Reserve had an additional tool, one invisible to most Americans: open market operations. If inflation pressures rose, the Fed quietly removed money from the system by selling government securities to banks. If deflation threatened production, it pumped money back in. A delicate balance, a wartime financial dance. By mid-1943, the American economy had stabilized. Factories were roaring, workers were earning, but prices were contained. The inflation rate stayed surprisingly low for a nation producing more war material than all Axis powers combined. This was the miracle of wartime economic management. A miracle made possible by rationing, price freezes, credit restrictions, and the invisible hand of the Federal Reserve carefully adjusting the flow of money to keep the war machine alive. The battle against inflation was the war within the war. The quiet battlefield at home that most Americans never fully saw. And yet, without it, victory would have been impossible. Chapter 5: Financing the Arsenal of Democracy. The United States did not win World War II through numbers alone. It won through production. An industrial surge so massive, so rapid, and so unprecedented that even Adolf Hitler, in the final months of the war, admitted he had completely underestimated American industry. But industry does not run on patriotism. It runs on credit. Factories need capital. Shipyards need investment. Airplane plants require steel, aluminum, rubber, fuel, labor, electricity, and machinery. All of it costs money, more money than private banks could ever lend on their own. This is where the Federal Reserve's true wartime power emerged, not through interest rates, not through inflation control, but through something far more transformative: financing the reconstruction and expansion of America's industrial base. To do this, the Fed worked alongside the Treasury, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, RFC, and several new wartime agencies. Together, they acted as a single financial organism, an engine that pumped billions of dollars into critical industries. This cooperation became the backbone of the so-called Arsenal of Democracy. Let's break it down. The bomber plants. In 1941, the Ford Motor Company was approached with an impossible request: build B-24 Liberator bombers, not by hand, as aircraft had always been built, but on a moving assembly line. Henry Ford claimed his factories could produce one bomber per hour. Industry experts laughed. It was too big, too complex, too ambitious. But Ford had something no aircraft designer had ever had before: unlimited federal financing. The Federal Reserve ensured that the banking system could supply credit to Ford. The RFC financed the factories themselves, massive structures like Willow Run, the largest factory in the world at the time. The result? A plant so enormous that workers needed bicycles to cross it, eventually producing one B-24 every 63 minutes. Aircraft rolled off the line faster than Germany could shoot them down. This was the power of financial mobilization. The tank factories General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford converted automobile factories into tank plants almost overnight. This required retooling, millions of dollars of new machinery, molds, workers, training, and raw materials. Banks could not have funded this transition alone. The risks were too high, the costs too massive. So the Federal Reserve and the RFC backed the loans, guaranteeing financing for steel mills, rubber plants, engine manufacturers, and weapons producers across the country. The result? 88,000 tanks, 2.4 million military trucks, thousands of self-propelled guns, a complete mechanized army, funded not by Wall Street, but by the Fed-backed federal credit architecture. The shipyards, the US also needed ships, thousands of them, destroyers, cargo ships, escorts, troop transports. Private shipbuilding companies could not scale fast enough, so the government financed new shipyards directly, with Federal Reserve support stabilizing the massive bond programs that allowed the Treasury to pour money into construction. The most famous result? The Liberty ships. Simple, cheap, mass-produced cargo ships that kept the Atlantic supply lines alive. At the peak, shipyards completed a new Liberty ship in just 4 days. A miracle not of engineering, but of financing. The supply chain behind every bomber, every tank, every ship was an invisible chain. Steel, financed by war loans, guaranteed by the RFC and stabilized by the FED. Rubber, supported by federal investment in synthetic rubber factories. Copper, purchased in bulk using Treasury loans. Aluminum, expanded through huge government-funded plants. Labor, millions of workers hired through government-funded contracts. Every link was paid for through a network of credit engineered by the Federal Reserve and the Treasury. The industrial miracle. By 1944, the numbers were staggering. 96,000 aircraft per year, 8 aircraft carriers per month, 50,000 jeeps per month, 2 billion rounds of ammunition each month. It was the largest industrial surge in human history. And the financial engine behind it all, the force that kept steel flowing, machines running, and factories expanding, was the Federal Reserve's ability to pump liquidity into the system and guarantee the government's borrowing capacity. Without the Fed, the industrial miracle would have been impossible. With it, America became the greatest producer of military power the world had ever seen. This was not just economics. This was mobilization on a civilizational scale. And it was only getting started. Chapter 6. The Manhattan Project, Financing the Unthinkable. The Manhattan Project was not simply a scientific endeavor. It was a financial operation of unprecedented secrecy, an invisible web of accounts, transfers, and covert expenditures that involved the Treasury, military intelligence, and the Federal Reserve. And it had one goal: to build the most destructive weapon the world had ever seen, before the enemy could do the same. But how do you finance a project that cannot legally exist? A project whose very name must remain unknown to Congress, to the press, and even to many in the military. You create a financial shadow world, a system that moves billions without drawing attention. That shadow world began in 1942. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers opened a new district, the Manhattan Engineer District. But what the public saw was just a small office in New York. Behind it lay a network of secret facilities stretching from Oak Ridge, Tennessee, to Hanford, Washington, to Los Alamos, New Mexico. Each site required enormous funding: land, construction, machinery, laboratories, electrical grids, railways, raw materials, thousands of workers, and none of it could appear in ordinary government budgets. So the Treasury and Federal Reserve built a classified financial infrastructure. Money flowed through specially coded accounts. Payments were disguised inside unrelated programs. Transfers appeared as routine construction expenses. Oversight committees received documents with sanitized line items. Even internal government ledgers often listed false project names. This was not mismanagement. It was national security. The Federal Reserve's regional banks processed these secret transactions through what historians now call black channels, isolated banking pathways that allowed massive sums to move quietly and reliably. Billions of dollars, in today's money, tens of billions, pass through these channels without attracting public scrutiny. The Fed's role was not to design the bomb. It was to ensure the money never stopped. Large industrial firms such as DuPont, Tennessee Eastman, and General Electric were paid through private contracts, shielded by classified procurement rules. Sometimes payments were routed through as many as 4 layers of agencies before reaching the companies actually building the components. Most government accountants assigned to these transfers had no idea what they were actually funding. They saw only the cover stories. Special construction, power infrastructure improvement, rural facilities expansion. In reality, these were nuclear reactors, enrichment plants, and research labs. But secrecy alone wasn't enough. The Manhattan Project demanded staggering amounts of electricity, steel, copper, and labor. Acquiring these resources risked exposing the project, so the War Production Board, supported by Federal Reserve oversight, diverted materials quietly, often under alternative designations. Copper, essential for building electromagnets at Oak Ridge, was so scarce that the government borrowed 14,700 tons of silver from the U.S. Mint to replace copper in electrical coils. Silver coins became machinery, vault metal became part of an atomic weapon, and all of it was financed through classified treasury channels supported by Fed-cleared transactions. By 1944, the Manhattan Project employed more than 130,000 people, more than the entire automobile industry in some states. Yet very few knew the truth. Workers operated machinery without understanding their purpose. Scientists were forbidden from discussing findings between sites. Railway shipments labeled as machine parts carried uranium ore, graphite, and experimental components. Maintaining this secrecy required perfect financial discipline. Every invoice had to be disguised, every transfer routed through layers of legitimate accounts, every audit trail obscured, and the Fed ensured the system never broke. If a contractor needed funds, the money appeared. If a facility needed expansion, loans were authorized. If materials needed priority, payment systems rerouted. The Federal Reserve became the silent backbone of the most secret scientific project in history. By the time the first atomic test, Trinity, ignited the New Mexico desert in July 1945, the United States had spent the equivalent of over $30 billion in today's dollars. And remarkably, most Americans still had no idea the project existed. The Manhattan Project was a triumph of science, but it was also a triumph of financial engineering, a hidden network of wartime banking that made the unthinkable possible. Chapter 7: Bretton Woods, the birth of the dollar empire. By 1944, it was becoming clear that the Allies would win the war. But another battle was already underway, a battle not for territory, not for armies, but for the future of the world's financial order. The United States, Britain, and dozens of nations gathered in a quiet mountain resort in New Hampshire, a place called Bretton Woods. Their mission was simple to describe and nearly impossible to achieve. Create a new global monetary system, one stable enough to prevent another Great Depression, strong enough to rebuild shattered nations, and fair enough to avoid the economic chaos that helped ignite the war in the first place. But behind the idealistic language was a more pragmatic reality. The United States had emerged from the war as the world's economic superpower. Its factories were intact, its gold reserves were unmatched, its industry was booming. Its economy had doubled in size. And through the Federal Reserve's wartime monetary policies, the U.S. government had learned how to mobilize credit on a scale no other nation could replicate. Now Washington faced a choice. Would it return to the old pre-war financial system dominated by London, or build a new one with the dollar at the center? The answer came swiftly. At Bretton Woods, the U.S. proposed a financial architecture with the dollar as its cornerstone, a currency backed by gold, supported by America's industrial might and administered through institutions that would shape the world for decades. Two of these institutions became pillars of the post-war order: the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the World Bank. Both were designed under heavy American influence. Both relied on U.S. financial strength, and both helped cement the dollar's global dominance. But how did the Federal Reserve fit into this story? To understand that, we need to look at the foundation of the Bretton Woods system, the dollar-to-gold peg. Under the agreement, all foreign currencies were pegged to the U.S. dollar, and the dollar itself was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. This gave the Federal Reserve extraordinary power, because as long as the U.S. could maintain the gold peg, the dollar became the world's reserve currency. Every central bank that wanted stability needed dollars. The Korean War ignites the crisis. The conflict reached breaking point in 1950. The Korean War erupted. Prices spiked overnight. Commodity markets surged. Inflation returned with wartime force. The Fed insisted it needed to act immediately. But the Treasury, once again, refused. It demanded that the Fed continue buying government bonds at fixed prices, forcing the central bank to expand the money supply in the middle of an inflation shock. To the Fed, this was unacceptable. Several Fed officials threatened resignation. Something had to give. The Fed-Treasury Accord of 1951. In early 1951, after months of rising tension, President Truman summoned both sides to the White House. The moment was historic. The Treasury wanted the Fed to maintain wartime controls. The Fed demanded independence. In the end, the crisis forced a negotiation. On March 4, 1951, the government announced the Federal Reserve Treasury Accord. It ended the wartime rate freeze. It restored the Federal Reserve's authority to set interest rates. It re-established the central bank's independence. And it marked the end of an era, the wartime financial machine. The system that had funded the defeat of the Axis powers was officially dismantled. But the legacy of the system remained. The Federal Reserve had learned a crucial lesson. Whoever controls credit controls power, and in the post-war world, a world rebuilt by the dollar, structured by Bretton Woods, and financed by American industry, the Fed would become one of the most influential institutions on Earth. Chapter 9: The End of the Wartime Financial System. The war that reshaped the world had ended, but its financial machinery, the massive architecture of controls, caps, rationing, and artificial markets, still lingered, suspended in an uneasy post-war twilight. America had built the greatest industrial surge in history. It had financed victory through unprecedented monetary intervention. But now, with peace restored, a simple question loomed over Washington. What happens to the wartime financial system when the war is gone? But the world it created remains. The Federal Reserve knew the answer. Controls must end, rates must rise, markets must return to freedom. But that transition was anything but simple. A wartime economy without a war, the United States emerged from World War II as the most powerful economy on Earth. Factories that once produced bombers, tanks, and battleships shifted to washing machines, automobiles, radios, and refrigerators. Families who had spent years saving because there was nothing to buy now flooded the market with accumulated wartime earnings. Demand surged, consumption exploded, but the financial system was still frozen in wartime mode. Interest rates remained artificially low, credit controls still restricted banks, price caps still distorted business incentives. Wage controls still limited companies. It was like keeping emergency brakes on while a train accelerated to full speed. By 1946, inflation surged. Workers demanded wage increases. Businesses demanded free pricing. Banks demanded the ability to lend. Consumers demanded access to credit. The wartime rules that once protected America now suffocated it. The system begins to break by 1950. The strains became visible. Bond markets twisted under artificial rates. Investors lost faith in Treasury securities. Banks struggled to lend profitably. Inflation eroded purchasing power, and then the Korean War erupted. The final shock that exposed the system's unsustainability. Suddenly, America faced another global conflict, another surge in spending, another escalation of inflation. But unlike 1942, the wartime financial system was not a tool, it was a liability. After months of tension, the wartime system finally collapsed with the 1951 Federal Reserve Treasury Accord. With the stroke of a pen, the Federal Reserve won back its independence. Rate caps ended. Open market operations resumed. The Fed regained control over monetary policy. It was the death of the wartime financial machine and the birth of something new, a modern central bank and a modern financial system. Chapter 10: Legacy: How the Fed's wartime power still shapes the world today. The Second World War ended in 1945. But its financial architecture, the system built in secrecy, stress, and desperation, did not disappear. Instead, it became the backbone of a new world, a world where money moves across borders in milliseconds, where central banks shape global economies, where the US dollar underpins international trade, where the Federal Reserve's decisions ripple from Wall Street to Singapore, Johannesburg, São Paulo, and beyond. This world began on the factory floors of 1942, in the war rooms of Washington, in the vaults of the Federal Reserve, and its legacy is everywhere. The dollar as a global weapon and a global shield, the Bretton Woods Agreement positioned the US dollar as the anchor of the international financial system. Every government that wanted reconstruction loans needed dollars. Every global business transaction increasingly required dollars. And who controlled the dollar? The Federal Reserve. The institution that had once been seen as a cautious, domestically focused central bank was now responsible for the stability of the entire international monetary system. But Bretton Woods was not just about currencies. It was about rebuilding a shattered world economy. Europe's factories were in ruins. Asia's infrastructure destroyed. Transportation networks collapsed. Millions were homeless. The US stepped in with financial power never seen before. First through the Marshall Plan, then through IMF loans, World Bank investments, and bilateral credit agreements managed jointly by the Treasury and the Fed. Every dollar sent overseas reinforced the global demand for the American currency and strengthened the Fed's influence over international finance. The Federal Reserve became the quiet guardian of the post-war economic order. Its wartime balance sheet expansion had taught the US that controlling money meant controlling power, and power was now flowing toward Washington faster than ever. But Bretton Woods also had its critics. Some argued that the system gave the US too much influence over other nations' financial decisions. Others claimed that tying currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold created long-term structural imbalances. But in the devastated world of 1944, the United States was the only nation capable of providing stability. And so, the Bretton Woods Agreement was signed. As the ink dried, a new global order was born, one in which the Federal Reserve, working with the US Treasury, became the financial anchor of the world economy. Germany had its tanks, Britain had its navy, the Soviet Union had its armies, but the United States had the dollar. The war was not yet over, but the financial future of the world belonged to the Federal Reserve. Chapter 8: The Hidden Costs and the Post-War Conflict. For nearly 4 years, the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury had worked as a single unit, coordinated, focused, and united by one purpose: Win the war at any cost. But wars do not last forever. And when the guns finally fell silent, a new battle emerged. A battle over control of the American financial system. The conflict began with something simple: the wartime rate freeze. During the war, the Federal Reserve had capped interest rates, 0.375% on Treasury bills, 2.5% on long-term bonds, to ensure unlimited, cheap borrowing. The system was perfect for wartime. But in 1945, the economy changed. Factories shifted back to civilian production. Consumers flooded the market with savings accumulated from years of rationing. Demand soared, and with it, inflation. The Federal Reserve saw the danger immediately. Inflation could destabilize the post-war recovery. It could destroy savings, punish workers, distort markets, and jeopardize America's new position of global power. The solution seemed obvious: raise interest rates, end the rate freeze. Let markets stabilize naturally. But the Treasury said no. To finance the enormous cost of demobilization, veterans' benefits, reconstruction programs, and global commitments, the government needed to continue borrowing at low rates. Higher interest rates meant higher borrowing costs. Higher borrowing costs meant political backlash. The Treasury wanted the Fed to maintain the wartime caps, even though the war was over. This was the beginning of the conflict. The Fed rebels quietly. Inside the Federal Reserve, frustration grew. Economists warned that inflation was accelerating. Bank presidents argued that the Fed had become an arm of the Treasury, not an independent central bank. Private investors complained that capped rates distorted the bond market. Fed officials felt trapped in a system built for war, not peace. They began quietly pushing for policy change. Meetings with Treasury secretaries grew tense. Memorandums became sharper, more confrontational. For the first time since the Depression, the Federal Reserve publicly hinted at disagreement with the government. But the Treasury refused to budge. A silent power struggle. The conflict escalated into a silent power struggle between two institutions: the Treasury, responsible for financing the government; the Federal Reserve, responsible for maintaining economic stability. Both had legitimate arguments. Both believed they were protecting the nation. The Fed argued, inflation will erode confidence in the dollar. The bond market will become dysfunctional. The post-war economy will overheat. The Treasury countered, raising rates will increase the national debt. We need cheap borrowing to maintain global leadership. We cannot destabilize the recovery. This was not a debate about economics alone. It was a debate about power. Who controlled America's financial destiny? The Treasury or the Federal Reserve? But what sustained that dominance was the Federal Reserve's wartime transformation. The Fed discovered how to expand credit on an unprecedented scale, stabilize markets under extreme stress, support massive government spending, coordinate with global institutions, manage inflation during crises, shape international monetary flows. These abilities did not end with the war. They became permanent features of the modern economic landscape. When nations trade today, they trade in dollars. When central banks store reserves, they store dollars. When markets panic, investors flee to U.S. Treasuries. This is not coincidence. It is the legacy of wartime financial engineering. The Federal Reserve did not just help win World War II. It helped build the post-war world. The birth of the modern central bank. Before the war, the Federal Reserve was a modest institution, powerful on paper, but constrained by politics and still finding its identity. The war changed everything. Forced to freeze interest rates, control inflation, manage credit, and support borrowing at unprecedented scale, the Fed became something new: a modern, Independent, global central bank, a world molded by wartime finance. The consequences of wartime monetary policy are still unfolding. The United States continues to issue debt at scales unimaginable before the war. Global markets hinge on Fed decisions. Nations rise and fall based on U.S. interest rates. And the dollar remains the world's reserve currency, a position reinforced by decades of financial leadership. The war ended, but the systems built to finance it are still very much alive. The final word. World War II changed the course of history. But behind the battles and the sacrifice was a financial revolution. The Federal Reserve was not on the beaches of Normandy. It did not fly B-17s or march across Europe. But it fueled every ship, every plane, every tank, every bullet, and every mile of supply line. It was the quiet engine of the war effort, the invisible force behind the arsenal of democracy, the architect of a new financial world. And today, in every market, every interest rate, every currency exchange, its influence is still felt. The war ended, but its financial legacy never did.